All right, welcome everybody. Today's webinar is about Industry 4.0. Don't let your OT hold you ransom. My name is Jay Monahan. I'm a managing director at NTT Data, part of the business consulting group focused on manufacturing and life sciences. I have about 25 plus years of manufacturing and consulting experience across both process and discrete industries. And I have a few friends on the phone today. Sushila, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Jay. So I am Sushila Nair, and I'm VP of Security Services. You can think of that as being product management. So I'm responsible for really working within the Chief Digital Office to make sure that we're securing the services that we help our clients implement to digitally transform. And I have 25 plus years in cybersecurity, and in fact, a year or so in being a CISO in a manufacturing organization. So
Thank you, Sushila. And you might hear the 25 years one more time from our other guest, Bruce.
Yeah, hi, Bruce Snell. I'm the Vice President of Cybersecurity Strategy and Transformation at NTT. I work with our high-profile customers to help them kind of strategize their security plans and programs. So yeah, according to go along with the trend here, I do have about 25 years of cybersecurity experience. The last 10, I've actually been doing a lot more work on securing OT, including a little bit of time as a product manager for an OT security device as well. So happy to be here and looking forward to the conversation.
All right, so a couple things about today's call. This is not just an IT-centric conversation. I can't do what Sushila and Bruce do, and they're pretty glad that I don't. But from my background, we're looking at customers that may have digital roadmaps. They're looking at 4.0. They're looking at assets and operational improvement. So from an operations side, that's near and dear to me, but by default, all the initiatives that we want to do when we look at gaining insights from our machines, looking at analytics, or just improving the process, it relies on a backbone that needs to be secure. So today's conversation is more about how do we bridge that gap between IT and OT. Although we said, OT holding you ransom, it's also the other side. We've seen where those business processes have to intertwine. And the first question, and I promise it might be a couple random just to see what your reactions are going to be, is how do you believe IT is viewed by OT and vice versa? Do you see that there's a shift between the two? Are they getting closer together, farther apart? Given the current state. Sushila, you want to go first?
Sure, thanks, Jay. So definitely historically there has been this giant divide between the two, IT and OT, and we have seen a coming together, more of an awareness of each other's priorities and issues. So I think there's really been a move in the right direction, and in the conversations that we've had with clients, where we see we're able to help both the OT side understand that things like air gapping is not sufficient, that you're still having security risks associated with it. That's one of education. And going back to IT, really understanding, that some of the security approaches that we use within IT may not really work within an OT environment where availability and safety plays very, very highly. So really, there are still some IT-OT marriages that require serious counseling. We're seeing an improvement in those relationships and assisting with that by being able to really educate both sides, because all they're trying to do is achieve what they believe is a priority. And so having that additional understanding of what those risks are and what the problems are that the business are trying to solve really, really helps with that counseling.
Okay. Bruce, back to you. Here's a question. What do you think manufacturing clients fear most about, that type of convergence that pops back up?
Well, the thing that I'm seeing a lot of is concern around the uptime and availability of the systems, right? We think back to, traditional IT security, the approach is, if a server is out of date or if it's got a patch that needs to be applied, you probably, have to wait, maybe a day or whatever to apply that patch, or, depending on your patch window. But from an OT perspective, we're talking about systems that need to be running 24/7 for years at a time. So a lot of the concern that I'm seeing when I start talking to OT organizations is they don't want the cybersecurity quote unquote cowboys coming in and rebooting systems and throwing things in willy nilly, right? Because from an IT perspective, if you have to reboot a server, that's fine, right? I mean, it's you may have a few minutes of downtime or whatever, but from an OT perspective, you're dealing with systems that have direct physical impact to the world and could potentially cause a dangerous situation. And I think that's an issue that a lot of the IT organizations don't really understand or don't really grasp, is that there is this real world ramifications of all actions. And that I think makes the OT teams nervous because they're expecting that, somebody's going to come in and say, oh, well, we can just plug this new switch in and, we'll just take this offline for a couple minutes and then be up and running again. And that's not necessarily the case. And that's not a doable situation.
Thank you, Bruce. What I want to do right now is if we can go to the first polling question. And as you look at it, please vote. You got multiple choice. You can pick more than one. But I just want to talk about this one right now from what we have is looking at how organizations and what's going on right now that may be initiatives that are impacting their IT/OT environments. And one of the things I've seen pretty large scale is when customers are looking at Industry 4.0 smart manufacturing programs, as I mentioned a little bit ago, where customers are saying, well, I have this initiative that I want to put a new shop floor system in. I want to get analytics. I want to tie the data. I'm going to put RFID in. I'm going to use robotics to move my material in the warehouse. And now with that roadmap transformation, there's an underlying IT. That also ties back to the IoT enablement. There's machines out there for some cases, I've seen machines that are 45, 50 years old that they want to connect to. And they want to get that data insight because it's proprietary equipment. Or, some customers where I have one customer right now, they did a major acquisition of another metal fabrication company, and they're trying to figure out what's in that purchase. It's kind of like a grab bag, and they want to know what's there. They want to know if it's secure because now it becomes part of their network. As always, plant modernizations and upgrades, it's always about those assets that you need to run the business. And we've also seen, IT/OT security initiatives that maybe are starting from a plant level all the way to the top, coming from a governance perspective, from a corporate, and anything in between. So if you take a moment just to provide any feedback on the polls, definitely appreciate that. Shushila, would you like to add anything to the polls? Anything that was there? Just any comments that you've seen?
Really, I guess one of the things that we have seen as we've talked to clients is that one of the challenges associated with many organizations putting in a consistent approach to security across their different OT environments and different manufacturing environments. And often where we see an enormous amount of inconsistency, some plants doing really well and some really, not. So, one of the areas that we really helped organizations is being able to create that governance, right? Because how do you secure what you have if you don't know how you're approaching it in a consistent fashion? So yeah, I'm a big fan of actually looking and ensuring that you've got a good framework in place and understanding as well that you can't just lift your IT security program and put it into OT, as Bruce said, a patching cycle that makes sense in IT may well warrant, in fact, can create issues not only around safety and availability, but may actually even void warranties associated with OT and IoT. So really looking at those programs and making sure that they're actually valid in the environment that they're being used.
Well, just based on our results, 86% Industry 4.0 smart manufacturing programs, and to no surprise, our second contestant, 71% runner-up, IT/OT security programs. Bruce, any thoughts on the results?
Yeah, I mean, it's what I was expecting, really, because as we look at, what I'm seeing in the field is a lot of this transition to Industry 4.0. And I'll be honest, there are definitely organizations that are a bit confused as to what Industry 4.0 means, right? And to be fair, it's not like there is a Webster's dictionary definition of Industry 4.0, right? It means something completely different to discrete manufacturing than it does to process, than it does to, you know, oil and gas versus medical, right? All of this Industry 4.0 kind of varies from industry, and also from organization to organization. I mean, you can have two organizations in oil and gas that are taking a completely different approach and have different criteria for what this Industry 4.0 or this smart enablement of all of these devices means. So it's a big bucket, and I think that's a lot of where, you know, it's this kind of big scary term of Industry 4.0 and people trying to figure out what that actually means for them.
Absolutely agree. The piece that I've seen so far in 2020 is upfront with everything that's happened this year. There was a big shift last year that was looking at Industry 4.0, and then this year in the beginning with all the pandemic concerns, we've seen that demand and supply chain shift. But now, since some of the manufacturing aspects are picking back up, there's a renewed emphasis on what that means today. Because if I balance out my demand and supply, now I want to be able to actually manufacture, and there's a lot more customers looking at it. The piece that I would ask is, Sushila, from your side, there's different industries, each one being a little bit unique. And you know, within our company, we service all the above across. So as Bruce said, process and discrete. We can go to high-tech manufacturing to somebody that's doing CPG, you know, the food that goes onto your shelves. What have you seen that's, you know, just a little bit different based on industry? Because they're going to be at a different maturity level. And as Bruce said, everybody's a little bit different. Have you
Yes.
seen something unique per industry based on your experience?
Yes, and you know, I think that that really one of the critical areas that we found when we're working with our clients is the value that we bring with that vertical experience, that industry experience. And you know, I guess one of the areas that have been of interest really as well as the medical arena, right? Because when we have a look at the impact of something happening with medical devices, there are really some challenges associated with that, right? And traditionally, you know, there's been an idea that many of the medical devices are air gapped, right? But we know, for instance, that some of them are not. And we also know things like WannaCry actually reached out and attacked Bayer medical equipment. So we know that in this environment that it really has been transformed wonderfully, amazingly, with so many new pieces of equipment that allows us to diagnose and collaborate in ways that we have never done before, which is wonderful. But challenges around securing it has been really an issue within this area. And we're seeing a growing interest among clients, a recognition that they don't actually have an asset inventory, that they don't actually know what they have. And overcoming that issue in many environments, not just in medical arenas, understanding what assets they have, and then what vendors can connect into those assets. And also, we mentioned with a lot of these assets, you know, the challenges around, can you patch them, right? You know, when Bayer medical equipment was attacked by WannaCry, there was no patch for it, right? They had to wait for that to actually come out. And when for one particular client that I'm thinking of that actually brought us in and said, you know, we want to have you come in and provide some security threat detection, which is wonderful. But as we actually had a conversation with the client, we realized that in fact they had no asset inventory whatsoever, and they had no clarity over what they had. And when we actually went in and analyzed that, they had devices from over 40 different manufacturers with no idea what the contract actually detailed as far as security responsibilities from that manufacturer. So really working with them, we needed to rationalize their supply chain, right? And also understand contractually, you know, what they should be expecting before they actually purchase. Very often we purchase based on features rather than on security.
Thank you, Sushila. Bruce, similar question, a little bit different. Not on the script, I promise. All right. So, I mean, based on industry, if you, in certain industries, they're somewhat more mature. I've seen certain oil and gas industries, if I'm looking at a rig in the middle of the ocean, they've done a lot of things to make sure that you have redundancy. They've made sure that it's secure based on what's there, given the volatility. We've had control systems for certain customers where they're already locked off. You have basically your DMZ and it's locked, you're not going near it. But what have you seen from an industry perspective that makes a difference to be able to go help them out, given that maturity? Some of them are looking for threat detection. Other industries are kind of looking for more, for lack of better clarity, upscale services. They're looking for a more robust governance model. Have you seen something different by industry?
You know, that's a good question. I think, every industry has its own challenges, right? And I think every organization within each industry also has their own unique challenges. What I'm seeing a lot of is, for example, the oil and gas. One of the kind of priorities I'm seeing from them is that asset discovery, right? Because if you think about the large complex network that's involved, and I don't mean network from an IT perspective, I mean network from refineries, from pipelines, from rigs offshore. There's a lot of moving parts, right? And as these moving parts go, some of them are in third world locations, some of them are out in the middle of nowhere, literally, right? There's a lot of undiscovered country, no pun intended, that goes along, I think, with oil and gas, because they just, frankly, they've acquired pipelines, they've acquired refineries from other organizations or other companies. So I see that from oil and gas perspective, a lot of it is that asset discovery. That seems to be very key to come in and, not just from a security perspective, but just from a pure knowledge perspective of what do we have on hand? How many devices are coming in? I was working with an organization that, we worked out this full security roadmap, and we spent a lot of time really looking into their process, looking into their governance models, and building out a security roadmap. And then after, a few months of getting, sensors deployed and getting things put in the field, they really said, look, let's back up for a second, because now we're realizing that there's a lot more assets out there than we knew. And we need to reevaluate our plan, because now there's, 75% more things that we have to deal with than we knew 2 months ago, right? So a lot of organizations like that, I think, are running into that issue of that asset discovery. On the other hand, oh, sorry, go ahead.
They're on the other hand.
On the other hand, well, I mean, I was thinking from a medical perspective, you've got a different issue where it's not the number of assets, it's the variety of assets, right? Because we think about, there's this kind of push right now, and I think more so with the pandemic and the requirements for remote access and remote monitoring, where people are just trying to throw smart on everything, right? To use the WannaCry example, I had a customer that their entire network was infected because they had a smart microscope, right? And that smart microscope was a microscope that was plugged into a laptop, right? That laptop was infected and then spread throughout their entire environment, right? So there is, in certain industries, I think, and I think medical falls into this, there's a certain Wild West kind of approach to let's just add smart to everything, and we'll figure out the security later on, even if they are thinking about security.
Well, you're teeing me up perfectly for the next question. So thank you for following the script. So let's go to the next polling question, if we don't mind. And this should focus on how integrated are your IT and OT security strategy. Now, we run the gambit. We didn't want to do 1 from 5 from 0 to 5, totally in sync, lock, stop, dancing to the stars. But we have seen things, at least from my experience, when we're trying to do these initiatives to help companies, that it's completely separate. One side's not even talking to another, or they're not even aware of who to talk to. They might be high-level guidelines coming down from corporate, and they leave it to the individual facilities and stakeholders to manage it. Or maybe there is some strategic integration, but not on every project. Or sometimes they're just locks in stock. They're just step-by-step in sync for what's there, and it's more of a combined governance body for how people actually coordinate. So Bruce, to your point of where they are,
Yeah.
this is different options that we've seen, and I'd be curious to see where we land up. And what we got, we're still collecting in responses. So Shushila, have you seen this across the board based on who you've talked to? Any insights on where you think we might land? Because I see part of the results. It's in the middle.
Yes, I'm going to go for the some strategic integration.
Well, hold on. We no, completed. No, it's going. It's live. All right. So if you bet that one, some strategic, it might win. Nope,
Yes,
maybe not
I'm
yet.
putting my money on some strategic.
But you know, completely separate strategy has actually scored a couple points on this game. Nope, now we're all tied, 33%. But if I did it the other way around, I'm not seeing anybody saying tightly integrated. So there's probably some work to do.
Right.
And that should follow suit to who we talk to, because depending on where they are, it's just different based on the stakeholders and the maturity level and what initiatives they have coming on. That falls back into, you know, our first polling question for what's there. What I'd like to go ask on this, if we go back just to my compadres on the phone and on the WebEx, what do you think is the challenge? One of the biggest challenges between IT and OT? Is it personality? Is it stakeholder management? You know, don't touch my stuff. It's mine. Your operations are off limits. Don't you dare put a piece of software on it. I got to run 24/7. Is it because maybe they don't understand what the other party's trying to go do? Or whatever you want to add. What's the major disconnect that you see as the problem between the respective groups?
Well, I think, you know, there's been a bit of tribal behavior kind of going back to the, you know, the early days of security, right? I think if we think of our combined 75 years of cybersecurity here, you know, I remember early on trying to, you know, provide some sort of, you know, network security, and then the desktop team didn't talk to the network security team, right? Or you know, they were like, oh, let's just punch a hole in the firewall, not understanding that there's a lot of ramifications to that, right? And so part of it, I think there's always been this mindset of, you know, I'm working on my area of security. I know it the best, and you don't come in here telling me what to do. Now, to be fair, I think it's a little more warranted from an OT versus IT security perspective. Again, because we're dealing with that real world impact. And we're also dealing with, you know, frankly, you know, from a technology perspective, somewhat sensitive equipment, right? Because, you know, I had a customer that brought us in to do an asset discovery because their previous vendor had actually done a Nessus scan on their OT shop floor and knocked over a half dozen systems, right? Because you think about these PLCs that are very simple machines with very simple, you know, not a lot of RAM, not a lot of memory. They receive a packet that they're not expecting. They don't have error correction. They just crash, right? So there are systems and there are instances where, you know, you absolutely cannot take the traditional IT approach to security and apply it to OT. And I believe OT teams are more concerned about that and are more hesitant to work with the IT side because they're expecting that sort of, you know, kind of ham-fisted cowboy approach that that it appears to be from the cybersecurity team.
Yeah, I just want to echo that, if that's okay, Jay. I mean, Bruce just made such a great point there, is, you know, and to some degree, you know, maybe IT's kind of earned that cowboy reputation. When we first came in, you know, there was a lot of this, hey, what do you mean you can't patch that, right? And I think the way that we've actually set this service up, leveraging people with OT capability, has really allowed us to have those conversations with both sides, because the reality goes, you know, often in our discovery with clients, the OT folks often feel like, hey, I'm air gapped, I'm safe, or, you know, or I don't have to apply the same security because I'm not seeing risk. And that is a very dangerous kind of position. So there is some education that comes about, hey, you know what, I recognize that I can't patch this device, but we need to put in some mitigating controls, right, to be able to reduce the risk of this unpatched device from being attacked. And so those kind of conversations where you can speak both languages, I think really brings both sides together. And I just love that, you know, capability when we have those conversations, that we are able to talk not only from a domain expert position, but actually also bringing in that OT expertise, which I think enables people to feel understood. And very often that friction comes from a feeling of we're not understood.
I agree with you both. I think the challenge that I've seen is usually just being able to build that trust at the end of the day. When you're walking into a manufacturing facility, and that's one of the best parts of my jobs, maybe not so much in 2020, not allowed to go, they're locked down. But when you walk into a facility and you get to do a gimbal walk and you're seeing how they make it, and you got all your safety glasses on and you're walking the lines and you're avoiding the fork trucks for what they're doing, and you can see how they're doing the process to build the simplest of things that you buy off the shelf, just like a Home Depot drill, you're good. Or you see the more complex manufacturing of, you know, metal making, and you're part of that process, you realize the quality and the initiatives that they put in place and how dear that manufacturing facility is. So when you walk in, you should be humble. But at the same time, you have to it's somewhat of an education process. We've had one customer that I remember distinctly. They have a 4.0 initiative. They want to tie to their assets, and they said they were air gapped. They don't have a problem. It doesn't touch anything else. And then you get the phone call. It's a threat detection. Help us out. We got, you know, FBI knocked on the door. We have an issue. And then with us, we were able to help out, but then it became part of the larger program because they realized that they were doing those other initiatives and became, you know, not just a one-off, it became part of something that they knew that wasn't going away as they were sharing data and components. So Bruce, the piece that I would ask is, at the end of the day, we have to build trust between the different groups and the different stakeholders. What's your thoughts on trying to go build that trust? Is it more of, you know, being to understand their manufacturing environment? Is it part education? Is it something else in between? How do you build trust when somebody says, I have 200 plus plants, I don't know exactly what the assets are, and I need to start figuring out my vulnerability right now? Because they have that shock and awe. 200 plus, I don't know what's there, but they know they need to do something, but they're like, I can't have this take 15 years to go do because I can't disrupt operations because they still have to produce. That's why they're there. That's their job. How do you balance that trust and gain that confidence that, you know, you can get in and be able to help somebody?
That's a good question. You know, a lot of it really depends on, you know, the knowledge that we have to be able to bring to the table, right? And I find that that's one of the benefits of, you know, working with NTT is that, you know, I've got a very specific view of security, right, from an OT and an IT perspective. And that's been kind of my world. But then there's also people like Jay, like yourself, that spent, you know, their entire history in the manufacturing side, right, and actually being on the shop floor. And so the thing that I've found has been most helpful is that it's not just me that shows up, right? That we have, you know, not a huge team, but we have a couple people that have, you know, wide varieties of experience that can kind of overlap and build a bigger picture together with the customer, right? And being able to sit down and say, okay, you know, let's look at your process, let's look at your procedures, let's look at your governance model, and let's figure out how they all work together, not just from a security perspective, but also from a logistics perspective, and also from a plant safety perspective. And being able to build out that entire story with multiple experts in the room, I think goes a long way beyond just having somebody show up and try to be the smartest person in the room, right? And making it known very clearly and very early on that this is going to be a team effort, and that you're not just getting whoever it is that's showing up today or right now. You're getting, you know, I've got people I can call on. I've got, you know, those people can call on me, right? It's this bigger network of having experts that can work together and work with the with the customer as part of an extension of their team to build out that long-term strategy. And I think that's really what helps the trust model. What's interesting, and just to kind of pivot a little bit on one of the points you made, you said something about, I don't want this to take 10 years to get done.
I've had a customer do that. They've asked me, they're like, I got 200 plants here, I have another 60 here, they're globally dispersed, and they're like, well, I have this initiative to get data and analytics, and it's part of my roadmap. And they're like, what do I do?
Right.
I don't have a governance structure in place.
And that's the thing is, like, if we just look at something simple like, deployment, like deploying sensors or something onto, different locations, if you're trying to do that internally, that could take a while, right? If you've got 200 locations and you have to go, have people trained in the hardware to be able to deploy, say like an IDS sensor for OT, that can take a long time. But what we've done is we've actually, trained up, a lot of our professional services people, our deployment people, our technical consultants to be able to kind of act as a force multiplier, right? So that project that, on paper looks like it would take 10 years, could take 10 months instead, right? Because we're able to deploy more resources at the problem, more highly trained resources to be able to go in and help out.
All right. Sushila, I got a different question for you. I promise it's partially, it won't surprise you too much. So given the years of experience Bruce, you so kindly added up for us. What I would ask is, Sushila, what's the most challenging situation you've seen, or just name a couple, because every customer is a little bit different depending on where they're with the roadmap, or if you're getting a call and, hey, they got a threat and somebody knocking on their door, like some of the, compromises that you've seen on their network. What's the most challenging thing you've faced with a customer, and how did we help at the end of the day?
I think for many clients that we've had conversations with, I think you really put it well, Jays. Very often they're saying, hey, where do I start? I recognize I have a problem and I need some progress. Or they really have this piecemeal approach and they don't know where they are. They're like, okay, well, I've got lots of different locations. They're all on different security policies. I think we're all, but I really do not have clear sight of what I actually have. And we all know, right, that you cannot secure what you don't know that you own. It is virtually impossible, because if I don't know what I have, I don't know what their vulnerabilities are, I don't understand what risk it poses. And yet for many clients, what we have found is that having an asset inventory is not something that they have actually acquired these capabilities over time, often selected by the business, often without security featuring in that purchasing, and often without standard security frameworks that they're actually referring to ensure standardization of security. So I think the big challenge, and this is almost across all sectors, right, is a lack of information about really where they are, right? So I think that's a massive problem. And whether you're looking at, the medical arena, whether you're looking at manufacturing, or you're looking at CPG, that very much rings true. And in that environment, when you think about it, everything from supply chain security, yes, if I have a device and I cannot upgrade, I can't patch it because I'm going to break the firmware, right, warranty or whatever it is. So how do I know my manufacturer? And this was a really interesting question, right? Asking around, hey, I actually have somebody that's providing support for my estate. However, I don't really know that they're patching the firmware. How do you know, right? Am I getting a report? How do I really know where I am? So I think that initial discovery and understanding where the client is and creating a security framework, a set of policies so that you really know not only what you have, but what your approach is to securing it, is one of the really critical areas across So I'm going to answer that, Jay, as being an answer that we actually supply across all verticals. And it kind of shows where we are in the world at the moment, right? It's really exciting. We're collecting data off all of these sensors that we're going to optimize, that we're going to transform, and, you know, but they're early days as far as actually securing that. And so for, you know, for our clients, I believe really looking at developing a approach and discovering what you have is really helping them across all sectors, and then providing with the things like, you know, managed services around threat monitoring and so on. But really, to start with, it's what do you have? How do you know you have it? And are you securing it? And do we have a standard approach?
All right. Thank you, Sushila. I appreciate that. I can't disagree with it. I've seen it with my customers. They don't know. A lot of them, they'll come back and they want to do machine connectivity and they want to tie something to every machine, but then they don't rationalize it. And just because it's 45-year-olds doesn't mean you need to connect to it. But even when they get there, they realize that, oh, that machine had a bolt-on that the vendor put on that they have connection through their DMZ to directly do the upgrades.
Right.
Which, Bruce, the question I have for you is, leading off that, for what you've seen, there's a lot of different pieces, and we're emphasizing the assessment component. Understand what you have, so then you could deploy and, you know, create that plan. But the catch for me is, if I'm looking at it from customers, they're across the spectrum. So some of the things we're doing, there's not a typical project that we can come back and say this is what we would do. So for somebody that's trying to get situated and they're starting on that journey, they have some of those 4.0 initiatives, or they're, you know, IoT, you know, security programs, or they just went through an acquisition. You know, what are some recommended small steps that, you know, they can start, you know, just to get on that roadmap or just improve where they are today?
Yeah, it's interesting because I've mentioned before that, you know, every engagement, every customer is different. But I think there's kind of high level points that I tend to go through, you know, when I look at an overall program. And the first one is really to sit down and figure out what your overall goals are, right? What's your security goals? And even to the point of, you know, it could be something as simple as, you know, let's not be breached, right? Or, you know, simple to say, not simple to do. Or it could be, you know, I want all of my manufacturing locations secured by the end of 2021 or 2022, right? Start with that kind of goal of what you're doing, and really that helps to kind of put things in a bit more perspective, because then you can start looking at, okay, if I want to do this, what are the steps to get there, right? And that's where we start building out that plan of how we engage and how we actually would go about building a roadmap to security. And again, you know, a lot of that, you know, the typical number 2 step is that asset discovery, right? Is figuring out what's out there. But as you're doing that, then that leads into, from discovery, it leads into vulnerability discovery, right? It starts letting you know where you're vulnerable, and that can inform your overall security posture and your overall security plan, right? Because if we look at IT perspective, you say, okay, I've got 99 systems that are vulnerable. I'm going to patch 99 systems, right? But from a manufacturing perspective, you can say, all right, I've got 99 systems that are vulnerable. I can patch 5 of them, right? The others, I have to build a mitigation plan around, right? Because there's always going to be things you can't fix. You're going to have hard-coded passwords. You're going to have systems that are never going to have a password. You know, I've used the example before. You can't have, you know, a 14-character password that you have to enter in to hit the emergency button on your SIS system saying that the factory's on fire, right? You can't. Those are certain things that you can't do. So as you start to engage, the small steps are really take a step back and look, right? Take a step back and figure out what your overall goal is. And then from there, we can start building that plan and building out the process, no pun intended, and break it into bite-sized chunks, right? For an organization that's globally spread, it may not be feasible to have every single system and every single asset inventoried and secured by the end of the year, right? It may be, where are my highest priority systems? How can I secure them? And then let's start spreading out from there.
Well, I think the biggest thing that you emphasized was compromise. So making sure we understand what's going in. So if there's a patch that I need to do, maybe do it during the maintenance window when they're actually going to do maintenance on that machine, and bring it back up at the same time. Because at the end of the day, when I'm working with my customers, it's about business operations. It's about continuity. It's about resiliency to keep them going. I mean, we have metrics of OEE and operational, effectiveness, and we're looking at quality metrics. But at the end of the day, if they're not producing, they're not making money, they're not giving people jobs. We have to understand that when we walk on a shop floor. So striking that compromise between the two departments for me is key. So I see the initiatives and I understand the threat, but if that threat is something we could mitigate for the short term, but we're still going to your point of the roadmap, it at least puts us in a better position where we were, so we can still maintain operations, but in a safer approach from what we would have. So Sushila, one of the last questions we have before we take any open questions, given where we are, is if I'm looking at that from typical projects and governance, and we're saying small steps, would you agree that, that assessment component, making sure that we have that as an initial step? Or do you have another couple quick words of wisdom that you can share?
When
Well, what you would tell somebody when they're just starting, for which or maybe they're more robust and they have an idea. At the end of the day, how could we help?
Yep, and really wanted to accent everything you and Bruce were saying, but really also maybe kind of leverage an example of how things can often go. We went into one client and we were actually doing a discovery, and I think mentioned, as we actually looked at the discovery, information we really discovered was that they actually had no policy around what devices they purchased from a security controls requirement, right? So right now, if you're going to start as a small step, contain the problem by going right from now, we're going to make sure that everything that we purchase, right, have security requirements, that we have the capability to have the capability to patch without breaking warranty, for instance, right? So really looking at some of that business side of things, and then going back, as Bruce said, and saying, okay, well, what do we have, right? What kind of asset inventory do we have? What's our approach to actually gathering that information, maintaining that information going forward? And I think those steps are really, really critical to being able to go forward, and then creating those security policies and framework, because as you said, from a governance perspective, right, how do I know that I'm doing well if I haven't got a framework that I'm actually, basing my security on? So that is absolutely critical, and getting that help to being able to do that from folks that are able to have that OT perspective as well as that IT perspective, because that divide is still there, and being able to have those conversations across both are really, really important. So that involves as well today educating OT folks about IT security and why air gap is not sufficient, perhaps to say I have no risk, and to educate people about the OT risk within your organization. And that small step will be a great move to moving all the organization in the same direction. So those definitely, Jay, I feel are some small steps that organizations should start on.
All right. So right now, given where we are in the timing, what I'd like to do is we'll just bring up one of the questions that we have that came back in. And this one is, can you discuss OT security for regulated utilities compliance? So Bruce.
Yeah, it's a good question. Back to Sushila's most recent point, talking about governance, right? When we start looking at regulations and, as we're starting to build out our security plan or security roadmap, we have to take these regulations into account. Now, certain industries are highly regulated, others are, a little bit looser. Our approach is to actually take a look at the current setup, the current approach that the organization has, the current capabilities from a security perspective, and look at the regulations that apply to them. And unfortunately, a lot of the regulations are really more just kind of best practices. There's not a lot of, very detailed information in a lot of these regulations that, we can really go in and make sure we're following word by word. Most of them are, more, kind of you have to follow the spirit of the law, right? I tend to take a more severe approach to these regulations and, kind of go above and beyond what, the wording of the regulation implies. Because, as you start looking at, from a regulatory perspective, a lot of these, these regulations are made for safety. But I think a lot of, when I'm talking about regulations with the CISO, they're more concerned about fines and, making sure that they're not called to the carpet because they're not following, subsection A of bullet point 3 of a particular regulation, right? So
but I'd add one to it though, Bruce. Apologies.
Yeah, please.
You get the fines, but there's also that inherent risk of being non-compliant. Now your product's exposed and you put it out into the marketplace. We had one customer, a large manufacturing customer, that their supply chain, when they were purchasing products, as Shashila said, they were like adding it on, and they had different policies based on who purchased it. But although the contract would say, when I source that from you, you're going to have ABC protocols in place and these standards, they didn't have a compliance mechanism in place to ensure that that was happening, which then exposed their product. Because it could be a product that was being totally outsourced, or then maybe it's a product where it's a subcomponent. So there's a big revenue impact at the end of the day and just overall operations exposure that I've seen in addition to the fines.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think one of the things that OT security can actually help with is that accountability, right? It can show that you're taking due care, because you can say, look, I've got, according to the regulations, I need to secure my environment. That's all it says, right? But here are the steps that I've done to secure it. Here are all the assets that are showing up in my, in my SIM, when I'm collecting all of the data from the communications going back and forth across the network. Here's all of the assets that I have in place. Here are the ones that are patched or up to code or up to spec because we can. Here are the ones that aren't up to spec because there's no patch available. And here's the controls that we put in place to secure that, right? So OT security can actually be extremely beneficial from a regulations perspective, because it shows that process that you've got in place, and it shows that due care that you're taking to make sure that you are following the spirit of the law when these regulations come down.
Right. Thank you,
And
Bruce.
I think as just to echo that, Bruce's comment that, often the regulations are not clear on the way that you would implement controls. And that's very true, I think, in the utility space. And in fact, I remember working with a client and us actually having this conversation about the way that we were interpreting the security requirement for them. Right. And we were interpreting it differently. And so we actually got a lawyer involved where we were looking at that to see. And in this case, it was actually providing some managed services within that environment, and whether the regulation was actually specifying that it had to be met by the folks internal to that particular utility. And so I will say that most auditors, and I actually have an audit background, are looking, as Bruce said, for intent. What is the intent of the control, and are you meeting the intent of that control, and what evidence do you have to be able to show your meeting of those controls? So I think it's really, really critical for you to have, if you are a heavily regulated environment, to really look at the way that you're gathering evidence to be able to show that you are leveraging things like best practices, so that, if you're interpreting that control slightly differently, that you are able to show to the auditor, here is how we're approaching it. So yeah, Jay, just wanted to add that in.
Those are all good feedback points. We're almost at the end of the webinar, and I had a special request from an anonymous questionnaire in the back about what's your favorite hat right now that you usually wear on WebExes. So, Sheila, do you have yours?
I do actually. So, right, I
So
didn't know I
this is
was
an
going to
inefficient
have
poll
a
question right
secret.
now.
Yeah, so right, I I feel this is very much me. Right, so
I
yeah,
thought you would have had more highlights on it, but you're pulling it off well.
it actually lights up. So I just want to point that out. But
All
it's
right.
not a smart wig.
Okay, I'm thinking you're beating me because mine are not that sophisticated. And Bruce, do you have yours readily available? Your hat?
Well, the only problem with my hats is that it's hard to keep the be able to
Right.
hear myself with the microphone over them.
Well, you're being polite. So mine, this would be clean. This is more like a manufacturing environment. And with that thought, hat goes on, and we're done for today's session. Thank you, everybody, for participating. Hopefully, you got a little bit of insight and learned something from it. And if you do have any questions, feel free to contact us at any time. We're more than glad to help or provide counsel, or just if you need a friendly ear to vent about IT and OT security. We're here to help. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, everyone.